Imagine this. You're standing in line at a store, minding your business, when an officer of the law starts mocking an elderly black woman for buying diapers. It's a moment that feels straight out of a nightmare, especially when the woman's dignity is attacked by someone who should be protecting and serving. But what this cop doesn't know is that the cashier behind the counter is about to reveal something that will change everything. In this video, we'll dive into an unsettling encounter that shows how assumptions can turn dangerous. The elderly woman, just trying to get by, is subjected to rude remarks about her personal life, all because of the items she chooses to purchase. But as the situation unfolds, we learn that there's far more to the story than anyone expected. What happens next? Well, the cashier, who appears to be just another employee, has a shocking connection to the situation, one that could flip the whole story on its head. Stay tuned because you won't believe what's about to unfold when the truth comes to light. Is this cop in for a surprise? You're about to find out. The elderly woman, Miss Jackson, had lived in the neighborhood for years. She was known by many as a sweet, quiet figure who always had a kind word for everyone. But on that day, something felt off. She wasn't in a hurry like usual, and instead of her usual calm demeanor, there was a visible tension in her movements. Maybe it was the weight of life's struggles, her limited income, the challenges of getting older, or the stress of taking care of a sick relative. But something had clearly been weighing on her mind. As she approached the checkout, the officer, Officer Harris, stood in line behind her. He was younger, maybe in his mid-30s, and by the looks of it, he wasn't expecting much from the transaction. But when Miss Jackson placed her diapers and a few other essentials on the counter, Harris couldn't help but make a remark. His words were condescending, almost mocking, as he smirked and made an assumption about why she was buying diapers. To him, it seemed like nothing more than a laughable choice for an elderly woman. But the cashier, a quiet and observant young woman named Sarah, was watching closely. Her expression hardened, and a subtle shift in her posture told the officer that this wasn't going to be a typical checkout. What Harris didn't know was that Sarah was no stranger to standing up for what was right, especially when injustice was involved. She'd seen more than her fair share of prejudice in the community, and this time it wasn't going to slide. As the officer's words hung in the air, Sarah, the cashier, took a deep breath, her eyes narrowing slightly. She'd seen this type of thing before. People making snap judgments, treating others like they weren't worthy of respect. But something about this situation hit differently. Miss Jackson had been coming into the store for years, always friendly, always polite. Yet now she was being ridiculed for buying something as basic as diapers. There was an undeniable sting to the officer's tone, and it wasn't lost on Sarah. Miss Jackson, meanwhile, stood there, frozen for a moment, her hands trembling ever so slightly. She didn't respond right away. She had lived through so many things, too many things, to let some ignorant comment break her spirit. But the officer's laughter had struck a chord. It was hard to ignore when someone treated you like you were less than human. And deep down, Miss Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about diapers. It was about her age. It was about the color of her skin. As the moments passed, Sarah's mind raced. She had been taught to keep her head down, to just do her job, and not get involved in conflicts. But today, she couldn't just ignore the situation. She'd heard people whispering about Officer Harris before, murmuring about his rough treatment of locals, especially those from marginalized communities. Now here he was, mocking a kind-hearted woman who had done nothing wrong. The store was starting to fill up with customers, some of them stealing glances at the interaction. No one said anything, too scared, too uncomfortable. But there was a palpable tension building. Sarah knew she had to make a choice. She couldn't let the officer get away with treating Ms. Jackson like that. But what if she made things worse? What if standing up to him only escalated the situation? Miss Jackson slowly looked up at Sarah, her eyes meeting the cashier's for the first time since the comment was made. It was a look that conveyed more than words could, a mix of exhaustion, vulnerability, and quiet strength. The officer, oblivious to the moment unfolding before him, continued his mocking tone, unaware that the story wasn't as simple as he thought. As the silence stretched, Sarah finally spoke, her voice calm but steady. "I think you owe her an apology," she said softly, but firmly. The officer's eyes flicked to Sarah, his smirk faltering. The room seemed to hold its breath. What would happen next? Would he back down, or would he double down on his condescension? The tension in the air was thick, and everyone was waiting for the next move. The room seemed to freeze. Officer Harris's gaze lingered on Sarah for a long moment, his smirk slowly fading into something harder, almost defensive. For a brief second, there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, but he quickly masked it with a dismissive chuckle. "Apologize? For what? She's the one who—" Before he could finish, Sarah cut him off, her voice unwavering, "For making assumptions about her, and for mocking her in front of everyone." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, there was an almost eerie silence, broken only by the soft hum of the store's fluorescent lights. Customers shifted uncomfortably in their places, some glancing at each other, some avoiding eye contact entirely. But all of them, in some way, could feel the weight of what was unfolding. Miss Jackson remained still, her eyes lowered, but her grip on the counter tightened. It was as if the world had slowed down, and for a fleeting moment, she could almost feel the weight of every injustice she had ever faced in her life. She was no stranger to being looked down upon, but today, something felt different. Today, she had an ally, and that ally wasn't backing down. Officer Harris opened his mouth as if to respond, but just as quickly, he closed it. His jaw clenched, his face reddened, and Sarah could see the simmering anger rising in him. The officer was used to being in control, to being the one who got to make the rules, to hold the power. But in this moment, with everyone watching, that power was slipping through his fingers. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not in front of a crowd. Sarah could feel her heart pounding in her chest. She knew this was the point of no return. She had pushed him, and now there was no backing down. Every nerve in her body screamed for her to stay calm, to not escalate things further. But she couldn't stop herself now. She wasn't just standing up for Ms. Jackson anymore. She was standing up for herself, for the whole community that had been too quiet for too long. The officer's fist tightened around his shopping bag, his knuckles white. "You don't know who you're talking to," he said, his voice low and threatening. Sarah held his gaze, refusing to flinch. "I know exactly who you are," she replied, her voice steady, but the words carried a weight that seemed to reverberate through the store. The tension in the air could have been cut with a knife. Every second felt like it could explode, and yet the world outside the store seemed to fade into the background. All that mattered in that moment was this standoff. Would Officer Harris walk away, or would he let his anger drive him to do something worse? Miss Jackson finally lifted her head, her voice barely above a whisper, but laced with a quiet authority that commanded attention. "Please don't make this worse," she said. "I've seen enough of this in my life." Her words hit like a hammer, reverberating through the tense silence. What was she asking for? Was it a plea for peace, or a warning that something far bigger was at stake? Sarah could feel the ground shifting beneath her feet. The stakes had just been raised. What would happen next as the silence stretched? Something unexpected happened. A figure in the back of the store, someone who had been standing off to the side, stepped forward. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, with an air of quiet authority. His presence immediately shifted the dynamic in the room, and the tension seemed to thicken. Sarah's heart skipped a beat when she recognized him. It was Officer Harris's superior, Captain Daniels. He'd been a regular at the store for years, but Sarah had never imagined he'd show up at a moment like this. His face was unreadable as he approached, but there was no mistaking the way he carried himself. He was a man who commanded respect. Harris looked up, his posture stiffening. His face, which had been red with frustration, paled slightly when he saw Daniels. "Captain," Harris said, his tone shifting from defiant to cautious. Daniels didn't acknowledge Harris directly. Instead, his gaze swept over the store, landing briefly on Ms. Jackson, then on Sarah. He seemed to take in the scene, his eyes narrowing slightly as he processed what was happening. For a moment, no one spoke. The entire store seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would come next. Then, without warning, Daniels turned to Sarah, and, in a voice that was sharp but calm, said, "I think we need to have a word, privately." Sarah's mind whirled. Was he confessing to being complicit? Was this a trick to make them feel like they had justice when it was still slipping through their fingers? Her body tensed, ready to push back if needed. Miss Jackson, however, remained unmoved. "What are you saying?" Her voice was soft, but there was steel in it. At that moment, Harris pushed open the door, his face pale. He looked from Daniels to the women and back again, the nervous tension radiating off him. You can't be serious," Harris stammered, his voice cracking. Daniels stood up abruptly, his tone changing completely. "You've already crossed a line, Harris. You just don't know how far you've gone yet." Harris's eyes widened in disbelief as the reality of the situation hit him. "You can't." But before he could finish, Daniels interrupted. "It's too late for you, Harris. This isn't just about one comment. It's about everything you've been hiding." Miss Jackson stood up, her face set with determination. "Then let's do it," she said. "Let's bring it all out into the open." As the door opened and the world outside came back into focus, it was clear that everything was about to change. What had started with a single mockery had become a catalyst for something much larger. But would the community be ready for the truth? Would Sarah and Ms. Jackson's courage be enough to break the system that had held so many in its grip for so long? Officer Harris, who had once mocked Ms. Jackson in the store, was put under investigation. His actions were scrutinized, and it became clear that he had been involved in multiple incidents of abuse and misconduct. As the community rallied behind those who had suffered in silence for so long, Harris was eventually suspended pending further action. Ms. Jackson, though never one to seek attention, became a symbol of quiet strength and resilience. Her decision to stand tall in the face of humiliation inspired many others to do the same. Sarah, too, became a local hero. Her courage to speak up, despite the risks, brought hope to others who felt powerless. As the dust settled, the community began to heal, slowly but surely. The road ahead wasn't easy, but it was a road toward justice, respect, and a brighter future for everyone. The change had begun, and it was only the start. Daniels gave her a pointed look, his gaze not unkind but firm. "You two, Miss Jackson," he added, his words of quiet command. "I think we all need to clear this up." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. What was going on? Was this an opportunity to resolve everything peacefully? Or was Daniel setting them up for something far worse? Officer Harris stood still, his arms crossed, seemingly waiting for his superior to make a move. The room's tension was palpable. The conflict that had started with an uncomfortable remark was quickly escalating into something much bigger. Sarah realized she was standing on the edge of something unknown, a precipice she had never expected to be pushed to. She glanced at Ms. Jackson, whose face was a mask of quiet resolve, but there was a flicker of concern in her eyes. It was clear that Ms. Jackson had seen too much, had been through too many difficult moments to let herself be intimidated now. Was this a chance for real justice, or was it the beginning of a cover-up? Would they be able to stand their ground, or would they be silenced in the end? The unanswered questions hovered like a storm cloud ready to break. The three of them, Sarah, Ms. Jackson, and Captain Daniels, stepped into the small office at the back of the store. The door closed behind them with a quiet click, cutting off the noise of the store and trapping them in a room filled with too many unspoken words. Captain Daniels motioned for them to sit, his gaze never leaving Sarah. She hesitated but eventually took a seat, her heart racing in her chest. Miss Jackson remained standing, her posture calm but firm. She wasn't about to let herself be treated like a child, not after everything she'd been through. Daniel sat behind his desk, folding his hands in front of him. His eyes flicked briefly to Harris, who stood just outside the office, looking more uncomfortable than ever. It was clear Harris wasn't in control of the situation anymore. Daniels broke the silence first, his voice low but commanding. "I'm not here to let this situation spiral out of control. I'm here to make sure things get handled the right way." Sarah glanced at Ms. Jackson, who gave her a small nod. "I don't want trouble," Ms. Jackson said softly, her voice surprisingly steady. "I just want respect." Sarah felt a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding leave her body. Finally, a shred of justice. But just as she began to relax, Daniels continued. "However," the air in the room grew heavy again, the hairs on the back of Sarah's neck standing on end.